everyone, good morning. You know, as a wildlife photographer, I'm always on the lookout for the best camera setup that best suits my needs. This is something we've talked about multiple times on this channel before. What is the perfect camera setup for a wildlife photographer? And that's something I wanted to jump into again today. I recently had something happen to me that really made me question whether or not my current camera setup was the perfect setup. So that's something I wanted to go into today. We'll go over some of the things that I look at when I'm choosing a lens or a camera body. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Recently, while on one of my wildlife workshops in Alaska, I did something I've never done before. We had just finished photographing a beautiful family of red foxes on the tundra and were headed back to the hotel when suddenly I dropped my Canon R5 and lens. They hit a rock and my beloved 100 to 500 millimeter completely broke. I'm so cautious with my gear and I still don't know what happened. Luckily, my R5 was undamaged and I had another lens with me that I was able to use for the duration of the workshop. This whole experience gave me an opportunity to do an in-depth review of my camera setup and an opportunity to update my broken lens. So let's dive into this process of finding the perfect camera setup, some things I consider when buying a lens and camera body, and at the end of this video I'll let you know what lens I got since my 100 to 500 millimeter broke. Let's jump into it. So let's go through the process of choosing the perfect lens and camera for wildlife photography, and at the end of this video I'll let you know what lens I've got in my backpack, what lens I chose to replace my broken 100 to 500 millimeter. Let's start things off by going through a few of the things that I look at when choosing a camera body for wildlife photography. If you've followed my channel for a while now, you know that a few years ago I switched from using the Canon 1DX Mark II to using the Canon R5 for just about everything. At that time, the Canon 1DX Mark II was my favorite camera body that I've ever used, and in some regards it still is. So what prompted me to change camera bodies? Well, this did. As a wildlife photographer that focuses primarily on backcountry wildlife that is more remote and not as tolerant of humans, this camera was just way too loud. Many times I'd be photographing wildlife from a blind. They wouldn't see me, but they would hear the camera and they'd be gone as soon as they did. Switching to the Canon R5 and its completely silent electronic shutter was one of the best things for my wildlife photography. So when buying a camera body, consider the wildlife that you're hoping to photograph and how the camera itself may actually affect the wildlife when you're photographing it. The next thing I consider when buying a camera body is its low light capabilities. There are so many different factors that contribute to this. We're not going to have time to jump into all of them today, and that's not necessarily what this video is about. Things such as what lens you're using with the camera body's pixel count, the sensor on the camera, and so on. The thing that I like to do most when choosing a camera body to use for my wildlife photography is I'll rent or borrow a series of different camera bodies that I'm interested in. Go out into the field, photograph a scenario that you generally like to photograph anyways, and see how the results turn out. This has been the best way for me to be able to choose a camera body to use in my wildlife photography and to be able to actually see the results before I purchase an expensive camera body. Thirdly, and this may not be applicable to many of you wildlife photographers, but when I'm choosing a camera body to use for my wildlife photography, I don't only consider the settings that relate to the photography portion of things. I also really like to know what the camera's video capabilities are. I really enjoy shooting video, so does the camera I'm shooting with film in 4K, 8K, slow motion, and so on. These are all the things that I consider when choosing the perfect camera body for my wildlife photography. There are some other things that I consider as well, but they overlap very nicely with the items that I consider when choosing the best lens for wildlife photography. So let's jump into that and cover both at once. When choosing the perfect combination of camera body and lens for my wildlife photography, one of the things that I always consider is the overall size and weight of my setup. This may not be very important to many of you, but for me as a wildlife photographer who hikes and backpacks long distances to photograph much of the wildlife that I do, I'm very aware of every ounce that I add to my setup or every inch of space that I take up in my backpack when I'm out hiking. Many camera bodies have removable battery grips that help to decrease the size of your camera body, and zoom lenses are fantastic, versatile lenses that help save a whole lot of space in your backpack. The next thing that I consider, and possibly the factor that's going to influence our decisions the most, is cost. I know a lot of wildlife photographers who are able to afford the latest and greatest camera bodies and lenses as soon as they hit the market. For them, that's their ideal or perfect setup. I've used a lot of those setups and they are absolutely wonderful. But for most of us wildlife photographers who are unable to do so, we really have to consider what camera features and settings, what features we get in the lenses that we're purchasing, that we're saving up for a little bit longer, and we really have to weigh the balance there. One thing that I really like to consider when purchasing a lens, for example, is zoom versus prime. There's a lot of benefits you get with prime lenses versus zoom lenses and vice versa. This isn't something that I'm going to go into in depth today, as I've already got some videos that cover this subject pretty extensively. If you haven't seen those already, I'll put links to them in the description below. For me personally, in my type of wildlife photography, I generally prefer to use a zoom lens over a prime lens, and I'll explain why in those videos. Again, if you haven't seen them already, go watch them. It does cover this topic pretty well and pretty extensively. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that there's not a single perfect combination of camera body and lens for every photographer out there. I know that's not the answer that many of you were hoping to hear today as you chose to watch this video, but we all have different species that we like to photograph more than others, or different scenarios that we photograph in. We have different styles of photography, and that's really going to change what our perfect camera setup is. Mine is going to be vastly different than what yours may be. So the thing to do is to identify your priorities when choosing the camera body and lens. Many of those that I mentioned today may be similar to yours, or they might be very different. But identify the priorities and settings and features that you get in the camera body and lens that you're choosing. Test them out before you buy them if you can. Borrow or rent that combination, get out into the field, test it out, and find what your perfect combination is for you as a wildlife photographer. So now the big question is, since my 100 to 500 millimeter broke, what did I choose to replace it? Well, I got another 100 to 500 millimeter. Like I mentioned before, when my lens broke, it really gave me an opportunity to analyze my photography, to test out some different options, and so I did so. I tested out a bunch of different lens and camera combinations, what lenses work best with the Canon R5 that I'm choosing to continue to use, and what I found is that for the cost and for the type of wildlife photography that I do, this Canon 100 to 500 has been the best lens, my favorite lens that I think I've ever used on a consistent basis that covers the most of the species that I prefer to photograph. So I got another one. I would love to hear from you. What are some of your top priorities that you consider when choosing the perfect combination of camera body and lens? Are some of them similar to what I've talked about today, or are there other things that you prefer to prioritize over others when choosing the perfect combination in your wildlife photography? Although my lens did break on my recent Alaska adventure, it turned out to be an incredible trip. We had so many amazing photography opportunities with such a huge variety of species. So if you're interested in joining next year's workshop, I've got some spots available on my website. I'll put a link to that in the description below. We'll be photographing multiple species, including foxes, puffins, auklets, and so much more. We'll be visiting multiple locations to give us the best opportunities to see as many different species as possible. Like I mentioned, I've got more information on my website. I'll put a link to that in the description below. And please, if you have any questions whatsoever, just let me know and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I hope you can join me on this one. It's such a fun adventure out there. Thank you so much for following along this week. I hope this video has been helpful in helping you to choose the perfect camera body and lens combination for your wildlife photography. Thank you so much again. We'll see you next time.